I'd just like to kind of start by thinking about what do we think of, or how do we undertake a typical assessment of flood risk? And here we often look at some form of impact. In this case, this was taken from a national scale study a number of years ago, just to provide some sort of indicative map of impact, and then some form of probability. And this is the kind of location of floodplains as they are concentrated across England and Wales. We bring those together, integrate those together in some way, and we come up with some sort of flood risk. And for this, the national scale assessment, that was expressed in terms of expected annual damages, integrating a series of different probabilities of different extreme events together and their respective impacts. Now, that's provides some very useful information in terms of understanding and prioritizing investments. But what also becomes obvious is that depending on where we are, our sort of capabilities, and a whole load of other sort of factors, actually the risks, the impacts of different events are not always as easily predictable as we might hope. Some floods often generate much higher damages or lead to greater loss of life, even in the same location. Communities can get back on their feet much more quickly sometimes, but others will struggle. Sometimes we have to think about how we balance those sort of short-term risks of events, individual events and preparation, against long-term risk management. And a whole host of non-structural interventions like flood warnings and so on can make a substantial difference to the impacts and damages associated with individual flooding events. And of course, a lot of these are mediated by choices made by individuals or key flood management organisations in terms of how they respond to the events before, immediately before, and during and after. And so that sort of human element in the system is often overlooked, and that led to the kind of, I suppose, hypothesis that by coupling an agent-based simulation with a physical flood model, we could capture some of those activities and responses. And in agent-based modeling terms, an agent is an entity, often representing an individual or an organization, that can function autonomously, and they can move around or interact with some environment in which other processes and agents exist. So on the right-hand side there, a kind of conceptual view of representing people, some form of hazard with its physical attributes, and of course the physical environment of an urban area. And so by combining those agents, that environment, but also a description of how agents interact with each other and how agents interact with their environments, and throwing hundreds or thousands of these agents together, we can start to try to simulate large-scale responses in urban areas to flooding. And so using these sorts of principles developed, and this is going back a few years ago when this was first developed, an agent-based modeling system that coupled, if I get onto the next screen, but was used to kind of couple a hydrodynamic model with a representation of people moving around road networks and in between buildings or houses and shops and so on. This model to capture kind of the response to flood incidents was originally developed in a specific platform for agent-based modeling called NetLogo. And that has some quite well-established roots. And the great thing about NetLogo is that it's quick to get something up. It is designed to build agent-based simulations in. And that allowed us to get something moving quickly, demonstrate a proof of concept before working it up into a more substantial platform. But of course, like all things that are kind of intermediate layers to facilitate the development of agent-based modeling, there are, I suppose, performance challenges associated with that, and also unfamiliarity with the wider kind of community who weren't experts and undertaking agent-based modeling already. And as kind of interest in this grew, it became clear we needed to kind of make the model a bit more accessible and a bit faster and available in languages that people would like. And that's where the DAFNI Centre for Excellence project came in, translating the NetLogo into Java and embedding it on DAFNI and making it available. And so to kind of give an overview of the model structure, that we have this agent-based environment that, if you like, a flood simulation and the agents interact. And so here, this might, I'll come show some more pictures in a moment, but this might be the urban area. We have a physically based flooding simulation, and then individual agents responding to that or to other information they might receive from each other or from, example, a flood warning disseminated widely. That the environment is built using geospatial data describing the location of flood defences, the elevation of the ground, the transport network, and the types of properties, where they are, and what their use is. The agents, they have a series of behaviour rules. And broadly, in the example I'm going to show, there are three key types of rules. One of those is what they just do, day-to-day, normal interaction, without any kind of underlying flood conditions. Then there's how they respond to information around a flood warning. And then the other one is how they respond if they physically see flood water. That coming out of the agent-based model, we have an understanding of where people are, and therefore we can use that to understand not just what properties are flooded, but also where people are maybe exposed to flood water of velocity or depth that is places them at greater risk of drowning. So rather than having a damage function, as you might if you're trying to establish the damages of flood, you have a kind of vulnerability function of people's safety. And just as with a traditional sort of economic analysis, you can then use that to inform risks to people and safety. You can then use this to test a wide range of different scenarios, whether those are different storm surge conditions, flood conditions, different defense failure locations, different times of day. Is it during the rush hour? Is it late at night when everyone's in bed? And so on. And also trial different types of flood warning or evacuation strategies. And whilst this doesn't kind of simulate every single type of response, it does capture those that we were kind of I suppose our kind of key stakeholders in the Environment Agency highlighted as priorities to look at in the first instance. And so this screen is a video, and I hope you can kind of see some of it. It doesn't always look great when transmitted over the screen, but what you might see, hopefully, is a lot of blue that is coming from the sea into a town in North Wales called Tywyn, over on the left-hand side of the image, and Rhyl on the right-hand side. You can see these red lines, which indicate the location of flood defences, although you will have seen that a significant proportion of them in this video scenario have been breached, and floodwater is now creeping in to the town. That there are a series of red blobs that are moving around a grey road network, and those red blobs are people that are driving around on the road, and they have received some information now encouraging them to go to the evacuation shelter, which in this case is hidden underneath the safety of the Newcastle University logo towards the sort of bottom right of the video screen. Now, you also see some yellow and green blobs. The yellow blobs are houses, and the green blobs are non-residential properties, so businesses or other non-housing locations, schools perhaps, and hospitals, and so on. And what we see over time is that as more people respond to the flood warning, there's a kind of queue of red blobs traveling on the road. If I down to, oh, the video's paused. No, there we go. Along the roads, and heading towards the kind of in a slightly congested way in places, heading down towards the Newcastle logo. And that is showing people trying to take the most efficient route in terms of journey time out towards what they're told is the evacuation location. Of course, this is one very specific scenario where there's, oh, and there's the end of the video there. One very specific scenario where we have just one location and everyone is trying to get to the same place. What might have been less obvious, though, is of course that a lot of red blobs got flooded, a lot of houses got flooded, and those places would have had people in them, and they that information can of course all be recorded and extracted from each of these simulations. So this just gives a sense of the sort of visual, if you like, product that comes out of this. But the real sort of learning, I think, comes from analysis, not just of one simulation, but a whole host. And we'll kind of explore some of those in a moment. But first, I just wanted to kind of come back to what's underneath some of this modeling. So although that video probably looks quite grainy, quite blocky, don't be fooled that the underlying road network is topologically correct, and it is not people traveling on blocks, but actually on a proper network that comes straight out of, in this case, Ordnance Survey data. And the location of buildings and their use, again, also comes out of Ordnance Survey and the National Property Database data. So we have a good idea of where people are living, the sorts of places they go to work, school, or shopping, and the road network along which they can travel. For reasons of kind of computational efficiency, the flood spreading model is actually over a grid, and was based on not the latest, but an earlier iteration of the list flood model that was developed by Paul Bates and other colleagues at Newcastle University, Bristol University, apologies, a number of years ago. And that allows us to capture some of the key kind of dynamics of that flood spreading over a grid that is interacting with the sort of the building and the transport network layer. Now, one of the things we soon established was that because over the course of a day, people are in all sorts of different places. If you receive a flood warning when you're at work, you're going to be somewhere different to if you receive it at 8 o'clock at night, and so on. And we realized that to explore a wide range of scenarios, we had to sort of devise ways of allowing a kind of almost a certain amount of background activity, typical daily routines of where people start their day, what they do throughout it, and where they end back up at the end of the day. And to do that, we found that national travel survey data provided some value, but was pretty limited because it is, of course, a national survey. So we were able to combine that, fortunately, in this case, with some really fantastic local transport sort of survey information that had been collected by the local authority to understand the sorts of travelling people do over the course of a day. And this allowed us to, when compiled with some sort of demographic information, to develop a series of, if you like, typical routines whereby depending on your family unit and employment status and so on, you might spend time at dropping children off at school, going to shops, going to work, doing some sort of recreational activity in the evening, and so on. Those were given a stochastic element to reflect the kind of variability in a lot of the survey data, both in terms of exact timings, but also in terms of it isn't necessarily typically an exact routine for everybody every day. There is always some variability. And so all of these together were combined to provide that sort of basic agent rule set and describe where people are at any one time during the course of a day. Of course, all of that gets disrupted if people receive a flood warning and then they make some sort of decision as to what they do. Do they receive it and do nothing? Do they receive it and evacuate? Do they receive it, try and rush to school to collect their children and then evacuate, or some other choice? And so those are the sorts of things this allows us to explore, the sensitivity to some of those things. But first, I'm going to build up a series of different example outputs and insights that we were able to derive so far. And so here, this is just a single, if you like, set of impacts from one event. This was the event that took place, actually, it's trying to replicate the event that took place in 1990 when Towyn flooded as a result of the breach of what is labelled here Flood Defence F. So pretty much in the middle of the sort of the low-lying area of the town. And that here, what you can see is from the model, we're able to identify where people are on the road network or in buildings. So the buildings are the blobs, and the kind of the linear red indicates the number of agents on a particular stretch of road, to establish where there are, if you like, the sort of hotspots of vulnerability. And this is for just one single event. By kind of building up and simulating a very wide range of flood defense failures and exploring different amounts of sort of flood warning notice, and then we can start to build what these I've referred to as these kind of almost vulnerability functions. So here, what I've plotted is for individual defenses, the kind of the loading, the storm surge level in the estuary, and then the amount of flood warning time people receive. And as you can see, and might expect, the more warning time people receive, the fewer agents are exposed to dangerous water, the less, obviously, the more vulnerable. And I should say the axis is slightly confusing. Minus 50 minutes actually means they received nearly an hour's notice and acted on that instantly in that time to take action. And 50 minutes is actually 50 minutes after the flood started occurring. So sorry, that is not the most intuitive time frame. And as you might expect as well, bigger storm surges lead to more people being put at risk of flooding. And the scale of the impact varies between different flood defences. So that Defence F that I highlighted earlier, that breached in 1990, puts more people in the way of deeper, more dangerous water than Defence C, which is over to the west of Tywyn. And that's perhaps not an unintuitive result, because I suppose there are more people that live immediately behind, or in caravans in particular, immediately behind that flood defence F. And so this provides some insights into the relationship between the magnitude of the storm surge, the location of a breach, and the amount of warning time that people are or given, or perhaps more accurately, rather than warning time, this is basically when people start to act if they have received a warning. Now, one of the interesting things about this was that, if you like, there's was trying to understand the sort of variability within the model, and so to kind of explore some of this, did a whole load, thousands of simulations. In this case, just comparing the same one single event of flood defence F breaching. Spent a lot of time on this 1990 event at the same storm level, storm surge conditions as that, looking at if we just change the random seed in our agent-based model, what does that mean for the kind of variance in the outputs, with warning, with a flood warning, or without a flood warning? Now, by changing the random seed, effectively all we're doing is we're changing where agents start and the order in which the agents' decisions are sequenced. And what I suppose was kind of reassuring was that there's a very clear cluster of the results. That this, it makes a difference, but it doesn't make a kind of, if you like, qualitative difference. We don't find sort of huge bifurcation in the way the model responds. But what I did find interesting was that the uncertainty spread seems to be far greater when there's no flood warning compared to if there is a flood warning and people get out. And that wasn't necessarily immediately intuitive. But it, of course, the reason this isn't because the model uncertainty is reduced, it's just the uncertainty in the output. Because when we have many more agents that are exposed to flooding, as you might expect they would be when there's no flood warning, of course, there's much more variability and sensitivity to those initial conditions. And so this just means that you have to be even more careful in or better ensure you have a proper understanding of that spread, which for those, when there is no warning and there are many more agents being simulated within that kind of in the sort of space where the flooding hits, there is a far greater range of results possible, capturing just some of that inherent model uncertainty. Whereas, of course, when there's fewer agents in that output of interest in terms of flooded agents, the confidence in the numbers is far higher. But here I'm going to come back now to sorry, I should have gone straight from this these functions here, showing the vulnerability and the impacts from different flood defences breaching, to talking about how you can use those to look at risk. So here we have a function showing the impacts under different loading conditions. And here I'm just going to think about how we evaluate risk, both in economic terms, but also in terms of risks to people. And use this sort of fairly standard approach where we look at integrating over the probability of a particular flood defense breaching, conditional on loading, multiplied by the likelihood of that loading, and of course the cost, either in economic terms or in terms of one of those vulnerability functions, where the cost is a sort of a human safety function. Now, what I wanted to do was understand how risks to people compared to risks to property and expected economic damages, because that is often the metric we use to drive our decision making in flood defense prioritization. And so I drew upon the kind of a risk assessment for strategic planning projects, a number of years old now, but just wanted to use this because there was this good case study in the same location, wanted to use the same underlying risk calculation that was used for that. And this figure is from that work, which was commissioned by the Environment Agency in DEFRA, and it shows the expected annual damages to property in the region that we've just been looking at, in Tywyn in North Wales. And you can see where there are higher expected annual damages, and some of that is down to the, if you like, driven by the location of property. Some of that is driven by the vulnerability of particular flood defence being a bit more likely to fail in that location than other locations. But what you can see is a bit of a spread of risk over the location, and a few concentrations in particular in the sort of the west. Now, from that report and that method, you can also identify which of the flood defences contribute the most to economic damages. Now, using the same method, but in this time replacing effectively that economic cost function from this work with the human kind of safety function that I showed just a moment earlier, we can start to think, well, does this prioritize the same locations? Does it identify the same places as being priorities for investment? And what was interesting is it absolutely does not. What we see when we prioritize on the basis of economic damages, we see that the investment should be targeted over to defences 4, B, C, and E, as being those where investment would most likely reduce expected annual damages. But if we're talking about population safety, then it's actually flood defences over I, H, and J, which are over the east side of the coast here. And one of the reasons for that is that people get trapped. If there are breaches in those locations over on the east, that water can sweep around, trap people in, or subsume and overwhelm people much faster because of the kind of topography, but also the, I suppose, topology of the roads network and how that can be disrupted as a result of different types of floods. And for me, that was a really, I suppose, powerful conclusion highlighting the need to look at these sort of multiple metrics and introduce multiple metrics into prioritizing investment in flood defense or non-defense flood management infrastructure, because it really sort of highlights how, depending on the kind of the metric of interest, that you can change really quite starkly where you should prioritize your investment. So I suppose that was one really valuable insight from this work. Another one was looking at how we can then test different types of strategies for helping people out during extreme flood events. And here looked at a number of different evacuation scenarios. And I'm just going to focus in on the same one that I have introduced earlier, that flooding of Defence F that took place in 1990. And in all of these scenarios, these are situations where people just try to evacuate to one single location. So we trial them all in turn individually. And what you see is, and perhaps this is not that surprising, is that if you try to evacuate to the shelter that is and only have this shelter as an option within the floodplain right in front of the defence that breaches, you have a problem. People can't access it, and of course people are likely to be exposed to dangerous floodwaters if they do try to access it. But you can start to see and understand how different shelters and their different locations provide different advantages. As I said, this assumes only one shelter, one location is active at any one time, and we know that we would unlikely have a situation where there's only one option for people to travel to. But it does also highlight that some of the shelters are either deep in the floodplain, like so shelters 4 and 5 that you can see over the east, don't perform well, even though they're not directly behind the breach points, because they get cut off during a flood, become inaccessible, or also start to get flooded quite soon. But shelters 1 and 2 over on the west, although they're on high lands out of the floodplain, actually people can struggle to get across there because, again, part of the flood event cuts off some of the key access routes. So they perform less well than some of the other shelters in different locations. Of course, the reality is that you would probably want to establish multiple evacuation points to get people out safely and give multiple options for them and also for emergency services. And so one of the things we also started to use the model to look at was to understand how these different strategies play out in terms of congestion. One of the things that I've observed in the UK is we're not well geared up towards mass evacuations. There was a bomb scare, I think this was in Coventry in 2008, and people were evacuated out of the city, but we weren't in a position as they are more typically in the US, to turn our kind of main roads into and use contraflow to get people out faster. And although it doesn't look more efficiently, this was a response to Hurricane Andrew 20 or so years ago. But they're opening up as many roads as possible, all to get people going in one direction. And to really show this, we sort of looked at how using multiple shelters can impact and change traffic patterns. And this map here shows in different shades of blue or red how traffic is altered as a result of just having either one evacuation shelter in scenario one. So this is the kind of red cross symbol in the bottom right hand corner, the southeast corner of the map, or whether you have 4 evacuation shelters spread around different locations. And what you can see is that there are a number of routes that are quite substantially reducing their traffic, over 25% traffic congestion as a result of spreading the load of evacuation capacity around the model domain. And whilst that does sometimes lead to some additional congestion near in the roads very close to the new evacuation shelters, those are often sufficiently far away from the kind of the worst places that the problem or the challenge of traffic congestion is substantially reduced for the most part, and this leads to far better human safety outcomes, as one might hope. But by being able to identify those sort of congestion hotspots, we can really start to tweak the planning of our evacuation sheltering and identify where there might also be opportunities for introducing contraflow to increase the capacity of that evacuation during a real event. Now, as I said, that the model was originally built up in a Java platform, and with thanks to my research software engineering colleagues here, through the DAFNI Centre of Excellence project, it's been translated into Java. And one thing that what I hadn't really thought about when I was putting in for that proposal, but they brought this to the table, and I think it's been a really useful part of the kind of the model improvement, if you like, is to standardize all of the input data into JSON format, and really facilitate how not just the actual code and improving all of that, but also how the kind of model handles data and data is prepared for use in the model. These tools are available on DAFNI and under sort of open source licenses, and very keen to see this used. And that I should say that's I suppose sums up I guess where we got to with through the DAFNI Centre of Excellence project, and some of the original model development was funded by the Environment Agency a number of years ago. So it was great to have them involved in advising on the development and implementation of this on DAFNI as well. But it doesn't just stop there, as ever. And I had a fantastic researcher, Olivia Butters, who's very keen on working in low middle income countries, and she's now left to save the world, if you like, working on sanitation and flood management around the world. And so, but what she did when she was here was use and develop this model to use not just Ordnance Survey data, but also OpenStreetMap and other forms of information to trial whether this could be a valid approach in some really data sparse parts of the world. And she developed a case study in Kibera, which is a slum in Nairobi, looking in the same sort of way at how river flooding there might require some evacuation and some of the impacts on this. And this required a bit of a change in that this is an almost entirely pedestrianised or moped-based space, that it's extraordinarily high density, and of course, data and information is challenging to come by. So there were an even greater number of assumptions made. But what was I thought was really interesting was that even at that level of abstraction, we were able to identify some really kind of key, if you like, locations of high vulnerability. So a bridge crossing that was especially important to evacuation and safety, that was at risk and has since been identified at risk, and intervention taken to strengthen that as a piece of infrastructure, but also areas that were known to become highly congested. We kind of were able to pick out in this modelling and identify those areas where we thought people might be more at risk. And so whilst it perhaps didn't come with the same level of confidence that we felt we were able to achieve in the North Wales case study, because of all of that extra data and information, we still managed to abstract some really valuable insights, and at least in the context of comparing those to reported vulnerable locations and parts of the community, we were able to kind of derive some confidence that this actually works and provides some useful insights into those patterns of evacuation and locations most likely to be congested. I also have another student, Michael Jones, who's only recently started his PhD working on this, but he's been looking at how other hazards and other types of social response influence outcomes. And this is some very early work from his PhD, just highlighting how here we have a kind of evacuation, perhaps a bomb threats come through in the middle of, in this case, it's Newcastle city centre, and showing how that evacuation could take place and where people end up within that sort of evacuation cordon, how long it takes them to get out, but also looking at that sort of bottom right graph showing how different types of levels of compliance or different types of social attachment. So this is the sort of value people place on family or familiar locations, what that means for how people respond to different types of warning information. And you know, this is sort of very preliminary stuff, but just showing how by kind of the model is being developed further to explore different types of issues and different types of behaviors. So drawing on different types of human risk perception and how this is taking things forward. So to try and sum up, that the agent-based model, I think it is a powerful tool that does enable us to consider how human behavior and response alters incident outcomes during floods. And those outcomes are mediated by spatial structure. They're mediated by the attributes of people and the sorts of day-to-day activities they undertake, and the kind of family members and so on they have to be concerned with. The nature of the hazard, and of course the transport links and connectivity. Those all influence risk. And the model kind of allows us to explore some of the emergent phenomena such as routes congested, and those are routes congested sometimes under multiple different scenarios. So even if you're wrong about the scale of the flood event or the particular location of a flood breach, where you can pick out places that are always or mostly adversely impacted, you can start to identify those places where interventions are going to be robust to a whole load of different types of conditions. That a particularly stark conclusion is this one, that social risk, that vulnerability to people can, if you consider that in, you might change the investment priorities that you make relative to just purely focusing on the economic. And whilst uncertainties are inevitable, that this does at least provide a platform for making some of those assumptions transparent. They could be tested, explored, and then, as I said, you can look for those outcomes that are intervention locations that are robust to a wide range of different plausible assumptions. But I think, as we're seeing with more types of non-traditional data, whether that's through sort of real-time processing of CCTV or other source of information coming online, and the use of AI, I think there might be opportunities to improve and reduce some of the scale of those uncertainties as we get a better grasp on what people do and how people respond to flood events. And the DAFNI Centre of Excellence projects, by sort of just making a really modest investment in kind of taking this sort of half-baked research software code into something that is actually done by professionals who know how to write software code well, hopefully lays the foundation for wider case studies, augmenting the sort of existing capacity of the model. And of course, I think by embedding it on the DAFNI platform, I think that lends itself to integrating with other models. So maybe taking out, for example, the existing flood model and maybe replacing that with some of the more advanced and more recent developments in flood modeling that are also available on DAFNI now. And I think Gilles gave a talk recently about some of his work in that space, or maybe some of the uncertainty toolkits that are available, developed at Bristol University, for example, that allow more systematic exploration of some of the uncertainties and sensitivities that I've only touched upon in the talk today. And so with that, I'll say thank you very much. I think we've got time for questions and discussion.
Great, thank you, Richard. Thanks for a wonderful, informative talk. Everyone, please feel free to send your questions to the Q&A. We have just started. So we asked, does the model include the impact of flood debris being carried along with the flood water?
No, it doesn't actually, and I think that would be a very natural next stage. There's been some nice work, a number of universities, I'm certainly familiar with some done at Cardiff, looking at how floodwaters can not just move debris, but also lift up vehicles and move them around. And if we look at what happened in Spain not too long ago, the kind of flinging around of debris, but also in particular cars, was a particularly significant challenge there. So I think that would be a kind of one of those natural next steps in terms of the development of this model.
Great. And was a question, what did DAFNI allow you to do that perhaps you think you could not have done elsewhere, so to speak? That's quite a plug for DAFNI, that one.
Well, I mean, the real key thing is that first off, the investment through the Centre for Excellence provided that resource for the coding and turning it, and I think I've made that point already. I think the great thing about putting it on DAFNI is that it forced me and the software engineers, research software engineers, to actually think, I think, more, I suppose, in a more systematic way about how the data was structured, how data flows through the model was structured, and how the kind of model was organized as a series of as a code. Because I think the when you write these research codes, often in a bit of a hurry in a research project, you're trying to solve a particular problem. Sometimes you bake in assumptions without even recognizing or at least remembering that you've done so. And so quite often I was discussions were involving the software developers sort of saying, well, I don't understand, why have you done this, what's this number here? And I was like, oh, okay, that actually came down to an assumption that I'd kind of or a case study specific parameterization that had been hardwired into the code that they were able to pull out. And so actually kind of making that much more transferable, I think, is really strengthen that. And hopefully by making it available on DAFNI, it makes it more accessible and usable to others. And that workflow process on DAFNI facilitates and allows people who don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of the modeling codes not worry too much about that and think more about the problem they're trying to answer.
Great, thank you. Next question, how do you validate the results generated by the agent-based flood model, particularly in terms of the representation of individual agent behaviors during flood events?
Great question. And I mean, the reality is you cannot validate these models in the way that you can validate a physically based flood model simulation, for example. So you have to take a different approach. So I suppose the first thing is those behavior rules are derived from and driven by observations as best as we can establish them. That we chose Tawin because there'd been a flood there in 1990. And we had some indication and some understanding of the sorts of things that happened. Of course, this was not a complete record of what every single person did. But we do know that during that flood event, which predates mobile phones, so of course it's, how people communicate and interact is quite different now. But during that flood event, we know that a lot of people went to the school to try and get their kids when they received a warning. But the school had already packed the kids up and gotten them out of the floodplain because, they were responding to their sort of established evacuation protocol. And so we have some sort of understanding of some of the things that happen. But of course, people are reflexive. And when I went back to Tawin on the sort of, as post 20 years on, they had a kind of an event to reflect on what happened 20 years previously. It's still very much in the minds of the communities, those who lived through it. Some people still have a little boat in their backyard for if the flood water ever comes back. That people's behaviours are often changed as a result of floods. So you can't ever kind of validate in that sense because human beings are reflexive, they learn. And so what we had to do is, as I said, I've already talked about trying to base those rules on observed behaviour, where it's recorded either in the case study location or observed in other places, and transfer that to the model, but also then to test this out. So sitting in with local members of the local authority, their flood teams, blue light services, who have not just been part of evacuations and flood responses, but also have an understanding at least of what they think should be happening during a flood event. So it's a sort of, I'm afraid, a bit of kind of judgment and doing the best we can with the information we have is what really comes into that. But I think this is where that the opportunities I referred to on that last slide of using non-traditional data as we increasingly censor our cities where there are flood events, we might get a much richer set of information moving forward to radically improve that sort of validation. But so much sensitivity to the initial time of day, where people are, how they receive information. It's a really challenging one to address in the robust way we might be able to for a physically based model. And I'll just pick up the next question as well. In estimating economic losses, have you included the indirect losses related to people, labour loss as well? No, is the answer to that. This is very much a real-time kind of incident, and so those sorts of indirect disruption to labour tend to take place over slightly longer periods of time, or be relevant more over those longer periods of time. But what you could start to look at quite easily with this approach is understand how people might be able to take actions within their property to make some localized reduction to damages within their house or within their to their own personal goods and so on. So I suppose in that sense it might capture some of that issue.
Okay. Well, I think I have to leave questions there. Thank you very much, Professor Dawson, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. The recording of this webinar will be up online. The recording of Zillin's webinar, who Richard mentioned earlier, is up online. And as will Brian shortly. My apologies, I'm just back in the office after illness, so I'm just catching up. But thank you very much for everyone for joining us today. Our next webinar will be on the 16th of July. And that will be led by Dr. Fabian Steinman on Mars modeling aviation resilience scenarios, which is a real obviously hot topic at the moment, considering recent BBC news, such as in Heathrow with everything shutting down. So hope you can join us for that. And we also have a webinar with the Institute of Civil Engineers tomorrow. Hope you can join us for that as well. And all details are on the DAFNI website on the events page. But thank you everyone for joining, and once again, thanks very much to Professor Dawson.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye.